If you have ever watched someone smile through something that should have broken them completely, stop what you are doing. You need to hear this story. Nobody in that studio knew why the girl at the podium kept checking her phone between rounds. She was 17 years old, laughing at Steve Harvey's jokes, giving answers quickly, holding her family together the way she always did. From the front, facing forward, making it look like nothing was wrong. Her name was Alia Brewster. She was the oldest of 5 children. She was wearing her mother's earrings because her mother had told her to wear them when she needed to feel strong. And she had not told the Family Feud casting team, not on the application form, not on the pre-show intake call, not in the green room that afternoon, that the 4 children standing beside her on that stage were not just her brothers and sisters. For the past 3 years, they had been her responsibility. Steve Harvey found out the way he found out most things that mattered on that stage. Not because anyone planned to tell him, but because the truth has a way of surfacing in rooms where people are finally seen. The date was February 7th, 2020. The taping was at Trilith Studios in Atlanta. It was a Friday. And by the time those studio lights went down, something would happen that had never happened in the show's 45-year history. Something that would make Steve Harvey stop mid-joke, sit down on the edge of the stage and refuse to move until he understood what he was looking at. Jalen Brewster was 8 years old, and he noticed everything. He noticed, for instance, that when the stage manager asked their family to line up by the podium for a sound check, Alia counted them quietly. 1, 2, 3, 4. The way she did every morning before school, and every evening before bed, and every time they went anywhere that was not the apartment on DeKalb Avenue in Brooklyn, New York, where all 5 of them had lived for the past 3 years under the understanding, never spoken aloud, that if Alia stopped counting, something would go wrong. He noticed that Alia had not eaten the snacks in the green room. He had eaten his, and his twin sister Maya had eaten hers, and their brother Deshaun, who was 11 and going through a phase where he ate everything in reach, had eaten his and half of their youngest sister Imani's, who was 6 and was more interested in the ceiling lights than in food. But Alia had folded her napkin over her snack plate and left it untouched. And Jalen, who was 8, and the family's designated noticer, had not said anything because he understood, in the wordless way of a child who has learned to read a room out of necessity, that Alia not eating was a thing that happened when she was managing something bigger than food. He noticed, later, when they were standing at the podium and Steve Harvey was making the audience laugh, that Alia's hands were perfectly still on the podium surface, except for her right thumb, which moved in a slow, steady circle. A motion Jalen had first seen 3 years ago, in the parking lot of Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn, when a doctor had walked out to where the 5 of them were sitting on a bench and had spoken to Alia in a low voice while Jalen watched his sister's right thumb begin to move. He had asked her that night in the apartment after the other 3 were asleep, and it was just the 2 of them at the kitchen table, in the particular late quiet that had become their version of normal, what the doctor had said. Alia had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had said, "Mama's going to be away for a while, Jay, and I need you to help me take care of everybody." She had said it the way you say things to an 8-year-old when you are 16 and you have just been told something that no 16-year-old should have to be told, and the only tool you have left is the truth. Delivered carefully. He had said, "Okay." That had been 3 years ago. Their mother, Cherise Brewster, had collapsed in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning in November of 2017. She was 38 years old. Alia had been the one home. It was a half day at her high school, a fact she would turn over in her mind for months afterward, the particular accident of timing that meant. She was the one standing at the counter, eating cereal when Cherise went down. She had called 911 before she fully understood what she was seeing. The paramedics had arrived in 6 minutes. At Kings County, the attending physician had told Alia. Because Alia was the one in the waiting area, because Alia was the one who had ridden in the ambulance, because Alia was, in every practical sense, the adult present, that her mother had suffered a severe hemorrhagic stroke, that she was alive, that the extent of recovery was unknown, that she would be in the ICU for a minimum of 2 weeks. Alia had asked 3 questions. She had asked if her mother could hear. She had asked when she could see her. And she had asked, and this was the question the attending physician would mention, years later, in an interview about that night, whether there was paperwork she needed to sign. She was 16 years old, and she asked about the paperwork. Cherise Brewster had survived. The stroke had left her with significant physical limitations and cognitive impairment that made independent living, in the assessment of her care team, impossible without full-time support. She had been transferred to a rehabilitation facility in Queens, where she continued to receive care, where Alia visited every Sunday without exception, where Imani drew pictures that were taped to the wall above Cherise's bed in a row that had grown over 3 years to cover most of the available space. The 4 younger children had not been taken by the state. This was not an accident. This was Alia. She had called her mother's sister, her Aunt Patricia, who lived in Newark, within 48 hours of the stroke. Patricia was 51, worked 2 jobs, and had a 1-bedroom apartment and no capacity to take 5 children. But she had a name. A caseworker at ACS she had dealt with years earlier, and she had given Alia that name on the phone and told her to call before anyone else called first. Alia had called. She had been calm on the phone. She had used words like stable environment and continuity of care and educational consistency, words she had learned from 2 hours on a legal aid website the night before, and the caseworker had agreed to a home visit rather than an immediate removal proceeding. The home visit happened 3 days later. The apartment was clean. The children were present and dressed and had eaten breakfast. Alia had prepared a document, handwritten on notebook paper because she did not have a printer, listing each child's school, teacher, doctor, and emergency contact. She had listed herself as emergency contact for all four. The caseworker had sat at their kitchen table for 40 minutes. She had asked Aliyah questions, and Aliyah had answered them. Before she left, the caseworker had said, quietly, that she was going to note the visit as satisfactory and schedule a follow-up in 30 days. She had paused at the door. She had said, "Are you okay?" Aliyah had said, "Yes, ma'am." She had not been okay. She had been 16 years old, and in the first week of raising 4 children on $140 a month, her mother's disability payment, which Aunt Patricia had helped her access as emergency guardian, in a 3-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn where the heat worked intermittently, and the lease was in her mother's name, and she was not legally an adult. She had kept that fact from Jalen. She had told him Mama was getting better, and that they just needed to hold it together a little longer. She had told Deshawn when he asked why she never came to his basketball games anymore that she was busy with schoolwork. She had told Maya when Maya crawled into her bed on a school night and asked if they were going to have to move, that nobody was going anywhere. One night, in the winter of their first year, after the four of them were asleep, Aliyah had sat at the kitchen table and written a list in the back of her math notebook at the top. She had written, "Things I need to figure out." The list had 19 items. She had numbered them. She had gone through them one by one, writing what she knew and what she didn't, and when she had finished, she had closed the notebook and put her head down the table and stayed that way for a long time. For a long time. She had told no one the list existed. She had eaten less than she needed for most of those 3 years. Not dramatically, not the kind of less that gets noticed by teachers or caseworkers. Just the kind of less that happens when you are the one who makes sure everyone else has had enough before you sit down. She had lost weight in the first year. A teacher at her school, a woman named Ms. Okafor, who taught 11th grade English, had kept her after class one Thursday and put a grocery store gift card on the desk and said simply, "This is not a loan." Aliyah had looked at the card for a moment. Then she had said thank you and put it in her pocket and walked out. And in the hallway she had stopped at her locker and pressed her forehead against the cold metal door and breathed until she was sure she was not going to cry. She had not cried at school. She had a rule about that. She had graduated in June of 2019. She had been accepted to 3 colleges. She had deferred all 3 because Imani was 5 and Deshawn was 10, and the algebra of leaving did not work out. She had told Aunt Patricia she was taking a gap year. She had told her school counselor, who had sat across from her with the particular stricken expression of an adult who understands they are watching something they cannot stop, that she would reapply when things settled. The counselor had said her name once, carefully, and Aliyah had said, "I'm fine, I promise," in a tone that closed the conversation. She had applied to Family Feud because Deshawn had found the application online and said they should do it, and she had thought for about 30 seconds about what it would mean to win $20,000. And then she had said yes. They had not told the casting team any of this. They had been on stage for 11 minutes when Imani, who was 6, and had the conversational filter of a very small person who has never needed one, looked up at Steve Harvey during the walk and talk portion before the first question and said, in a perfectly clear 6-year-old voice, "My sister is our mama." Steve Harvey looked down at her. He said, "What did you say, sweetheart?" Imani said, "Aliyah is our mama. She makes breakfast, and she does our homework with us, and she comes to our school when we're sick." She thought about this for a moment. "She's not our real mama. Our real mama is at the hospital. But Aliyah does everything." The studio fell completely silent. Steve Harvey looked at Imani for a long moment. Then he looked at Aliyah. Aliyah was looking at Imani with an expression that had 3 things in it at once. Something like exhaustion, something like love so old it had stopped being soft, and the look of a person whose carefully constructed normal has just been quietly, lovingly, demolished by a 6-year-old. She said, "Imani, baby." Steve Harvey held up one hand, not to stop her, to tell her she did not have to explain. He knelt down to Imani's level, which made him 6 feet of man, folding himself gently toward a child in pink sneakers, and he said, "Can I ask your big sister some questions?" Imani considered this with great seriousness and said, "Okay, but she doesn't like to talk about it." 300 people in that studio held their breath. Steve Harvey stood. He looked at Aliyah, and then Steve Harvey did something that his producer, watching from the edge of the set, would later say she had never seen him do in 15 years of working with him. He pulled a stool from the side of the stage, set it down in front of Aliyah, sat on it so their eyes were level, and said 5 words, quietly enough that the audience had to lean forward to hear. "How long has it been?" And Alia Brewster, who had not told her English teacher, or her school counselor, or the ACS caseworker, or the Family Feud casting team, who had not told anyone the full version of the past 3 years, looked at this man who had folded himself down to her sister's height, and asked a question with no performance in it, and she told him. She told him about the kitchen, about the ambulance, about the notebook list with 19 items, about the grocery card she had pressed against her forehead, and the college deferrals and the lease in her mother's name. She told him about Deshawn's basketball games and Maya's nighttime question, and Jalen. She looked at Jalen when she said his name, who had been 8 years old and had just said okay. She spoke for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. The recording shows it. She did not cry. Her voice was steady throughout, the voice of someone who has delivered hard information many times to people who needed it in plain language. The studio fell completely silent for the second time, a different silence than the first. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of a room that has just understood the size of something. A camera operator near the back of the set had stopped looking through his viewfinder. Steve Harvey did not move from the stool. When Aliyah finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Jalen, who was standing at the end of the family line with his arms at his sides, and his face doing the complicated work of an 8-year-old who has just heard his family's private life spoken aloud in a television studio, and is not sure whether this is the worst thing or the best thing that has ever happened. Steve said to him, "You said okay." Jalen nodded. Steve Harvey nodded back once, slowly, the way you acknowledge something that does not need more words than that. He stood up. He turned to the camera. "I want to talk to everyone watching at home," he said. A 17-year-old girl in Brooklyn, New York, made a decision 3 years ago. She decided that her family was going to stay together. And she did it the way people do impossible things. Not all at once, but one morning at a time, one grocery run, one school drop-off, one night at the kitchen table. She did not ask for help. She did not make it anyone's problem. She just held the door open and kept everyone inside. He paused. That ends today. But Steve wasn't done. He told Aaliyah that the show's $20,000 prize was hers, awarded in full, regardless of the game's outcome. Then he told her that the production team had been in contact over the preceding 48 hours. After a conversation between the casting department and Aunt Patricia, who had quietly flagged the family's situation when she submitted a character reference as part of the application with a coalition of organizations. A housing non-profit in Brooklyn had identified a larger, stable apartment in the same school district with a lease that could be put in Aaliyah's name. First year's rent covered. The studio fell completely silent for the third time. Aaliyah's hands went still on the podium, both of them. The right thumb stopped moving, but Steve wasn't done. He told her that 3 universities, including one of the schools that had originally accepted her, had been contacted by the show's Education Partnership Foundation. All 3 had agreed to hold her admission for the following academic year. A full scholarship package covering tuition, housing, and a stipend for family support had been assembled. She had a year to decide. She did not have to decide today. He told her that a pediatric social services organization would be assigned to the family. Not to supervise, not to threaten, but to support. Someone to call. Someone whose job it was to make sure that what Aaliyah had been doing alone could now be done with backup. Aaliyah Brewster stood at the podium of Family Feud on February 7, 2020, and let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 3 years. Deshawn, who was 11 and had been listening to all of this with the concentrated expression of a boy recalculating something important, walked to his sister without asking permission and put his arms around her from the side, the way younger siblings hold older ones, not seeking comfort but offering it. Maya followed. Then Imani, who attached herself to Aaliyah's waist and stayed there. Jalen was last. He walked to the front of the group and stood facing Steve Harvey, and he said, "Thank you," in a voice that sounded like a child's and something older at the same time. The opposing family, the Nguyen's from Houston, a grandmother named Linge, her daughter Fuang, and 3 of Fuang's children, had watched everything from the other side of the stage without moving. Lin Nguyen was 73 years old and had come to the United States from Vietnam in 1982 and had built a life from smaller materials than most people would think possible. And she understood, without needing it explained, what she had just witnessed. She crossed the stage and said something to Aaliyah in Vietnamese. And then, when Phuong translated, it came out as, "You already know how to do the hard part. Now let people help you with the rest." Steve Harvey pressed his handkerchief to his face and walked a few paces to the side of the stage. His shoulders moved once. When the episode aired on April 14th, 2020, in the middle of a spring when most of the country was home and watching more television than usual and maybe more ready than usual to be moved, the clip of Imani saying, "My sister is our mama," reached 23 million views in 72 hours. It was shared more times in a single week than any clip in the show's history. The hashtag the production team had not created. The audience created it, trended for 4 days. The Brewster family moved into their new apartment in the same Brooklyn neighborhood in March of 2020, 6 weeks after the taping, 2 weeks before the lockdowns began. The timing meant that Aaliyah was home when school went remote, which she had not planned for, but which she navigated the way she navigated everything, by sitting at the kitchen table and making a new list. 3 months after the taping, Cherie's barista, Brewster, was transferred to a long-term care facility 4 miles from the new apartment, close enough that Aaliyah could visit by subway in under 30 minutes. Imani's drawings still go on the wall above her bed. The row is longer now. A year after the taping, Aaliyah Brewster enrolled at Howard University in Washington, D.C. She chose a degree in social work. She has said in interviews, in the careful, plain language that has always been her register, that the degree is not about wanting to save people. It is about wanting to know when a 16-year-old calls a caseworker and uses words she learned from a legal aid website at midnight, that someone on the other end of that call already knows the name for what that girl is doing. Today, Deshawn is 14 and plays basketball. Maya is 12 and reads everything she can find. Imani is 9 and has decided she wants to be either a scientist or a chef and sees no reason these are mutually exclusive. Jalen is 11 and is still the family noticer, a skill his sister has told him more than once that is going to make him extraordinary. Aaliyah is 20 years old. She calls home every Sunday night. Every Sunday, she counts to 4 before she hangs up. The math notebook with the 19-item list is in a box under her dorm room bed. She has not opened it since the February night she made it. She has not needed to. Every item on that list has been crossed off. Some by her own hand, some by people who showed up when she finally let them. She keeps the notebook anyway, not as a reminder of how hard it was, as proof that she did it. Some burdens arrive before we are ready to carry them and stay long past the moment we asked for help. The extraordinary thing is not that a 17-year-old girl held a family together for 3 years. The extraordinary thing is that she did it one ordinary morning at a time, counting to 4, pressing her thumb in a slow circle, keeping the door open. And when the room finally went quiet enough for someone to ask the right question, she answered it plainly, the way she had always done everything, without asking for more than she needed, and without pretending she needed less. If this story about a girl who refused to let her family fall apart, and the moment a studio full of strangers finally saw what she had been carrying, moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to know that the quiet ones carrying the most are always worth stopping for. Have you ever known someone who held everything together in silence? Let us know in the comments, and ring that notification bell for more moments that restore your faith in what people are capable of when they decide not to give up.